Welcome to the Embodiment Matters podcast with me, Erin Giesemann-Rabke, and my beloved Carl Rabke. We don't have the luxury of living in ordinary times, but rather we live in extraordinary ones where the way we live in the next decade will make a huge difference in the future of life on planet Earth. We aspire in this tapestry of rich conversations drawn from a variety of wise perspectives to share resources to help you embody the wisdom, compassion, and skillful actions that are needed during these times. You can find out more about our classes and sign up for our newsletter at embodimentmatters.com. You can also become a supporting member of our podcast with a small monthly donation. Look for Embodiment Matters at patreon.com. Hey friends and listeners, it's Erin here, and I'm really thrilled to share this conversation with you. Carl and I had the great honor of interviewing Sherri Mitchell, who is the author of a gorgeous book called Sacred Instructions, which we highly recommend. While we only touched on just a small fraction of the questions we were wanting to ask Sherri, we did explore many rich topics together, including her beautiful perspective on embodiment, how we can come to recognize our power, and also how this can get confused in a capitalist culture. Sherri also speaks to what the law of attraction gets right and wrong. Sherri speaks about living in a time of prophecy and what that entails. We talk about the sources of her strength, Indigenous values as compared to Euro-centric values, and the resulting differences in culture and experience. We talk about the need to examine and change the stories we're telling, for example, the celebration of St. Patrick's Day and a perspective on that holiday which may be new to some of our listeners. We also talked about her incredible visionary 21-year ceremony dedicated toward healing Turtle Island. And overall, we wander together into this question, which Sherri asks really potently: will we exit the planet, or will we change our course? What a powerful conversation with a wise, visionary woman for our times. We are so grateful to Sherri for the conversation, for her work and her way in the world, and we hope you'll explore more at her websites, sacredinstructions.life and healingturtleisland.org. A little bit about Sherri. She was born and raised on the Penobscot Indian Reservation. She speaks and teaches around the world on issues of Indigenous rights, environmental justice, and spiritual change. Her broad base of knowledge allows her to synthesize many subjects into a cohesive whole, weaving together a multitude of complex issues and articulating them in a way that both satisfies the mind and heals the heart. She received her Juris Doctorate and a certificate in Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy from the University of Arizona's James E. Rogers College of Law. She's an alumna of the American Indian Ambassador Program and the Udall Native American Congressional Internship Program. Sherri is the founding director of the Land Peace Foundation, an organization dedicated to the global protection of Indigenous land and water rights and the preservation of the Indigenous way of life. Prior to forming the Land Peace Foundation, she served as a law clerk to the Solicitor of the United States Department of the Interior, as an associate with Fredericks, Peebles, and Morgan Law Firm, as a civil rights educator for the Maine Attorney General's Office, and as the staff attorney for the Native American unit of Pine Tree Legal. There's more. What an extraordinary person, right? She's been actively involved with Indigenous rights and environmental justice work for more than 25 years. In 2010, she received the Mahoney Dunn International Human Rights and Humanitarian Award for research into human rights violations against Indigenous peoples. In 2015, she received the Spirit of Maine Award for commitment and excellence in the field of international human rights. In 2016, her portrait was added to the esteemed portrait series Americans Who Tell the Truth by artist Robert Shetterly. She's also the recipient of the 2017 Hands of Hope Award from the Peace and Justice Center. Sherri has been deeply committed to cultivating and renewing the traditional and ceremonial practices of her people. She has worked in many capacities over the past 30 years, helping to highlight and advance the position of Wabanaki peoples. In addition to helping her own people, she's been a longtime advisor to the American Indian Institute's Traditional Circle of Indian Elders and Youth, and was a program coordinator for their Healing the Future program. She also served as an advisor to the Indigenous Elders and Medicine Peoples Council of North and South America for the past 20 years. In this role, she's worked with Indigenous spiritual leaders from across the Americas, helping to ensure that their voices are heard within the larger society. This has included bringing their messages to political leaders in the U.S. and Canada and the Indigenous Peoples Forum at the United Nations. She is the visionary behind Healing the Wounds of Turtle Island, a global healing ceremony that has brought people together from all corners of the world, and you'll hear more about that in our conversation. The ceremony is designed to heal our relationships with one another as human beings, and then to heal the relationship between human beings and the rest of creation. It's been attended by people from every continent except Antarctica, who have come together to pray with one heart and one mind for the healing of all life on Mother Earth. Wow. I'm so just thrilled again to read this little bitty bio and snippet into the wisdom and many skills and just devotion that Sherri brings, and so excited to share this conversation with you. So I hope you can listen with ears of reverence, and may what comes from this conversation support that intention toward the healing of all life on Mother Earth. Enjoy. Okay, welcome, Sherri. We are so looking forward to talking with you today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be with you.
I thought I would invite you to introduce yourself to our listeners as we begin.
Okay. Kwe, Gwanude, hello, and thank you for being with me. Ndeli wisi, wanahamu kwasit, najio, banawapskewi, Psilda, Delabama kawasus, Nelbanawapskewi, Nagakakagus, Niltibaik, and Nilita Hazio and Diane. So my name in my language is Wanahamu Gwasit. I am from the Penobscot Nation, and my family is Bear Clan from the Penobscot Nation and Crow Clan from the Passamaquoddy tribe at Zibaik. And I'm happy to be here with all of you today.
Thank you so much.
Yes, we're so grateful to be with you. So one of the ways we like to begin these conversations is by asking a question of what is embodiment to you? How would you describe embodiment?
It's such a great question. I often talk about embodiment and describe ways to become more embodied. But thinking about the actual definition of the word embodiment is not something that I think many of us spend a lot of time contemplating, and it's so important to the fullness of our being. And so for me, when I think about what does it mean to be embodied, it means having yourself, your deeper self, in a state of wholeness, fully emerging in the world with your presence and all of your gifts intact. And, this sense of fragmentation that we experience in life is so deep that understanding what that means, even when you say, to have yourself ready, present, and able to emerge in the wholeness of your being doesn't even make sense for a lot of people. They still want to know, well, what does that mean to be whole within yourself? What does it mean to be emerging with a sense of wholeness? And for me, that emergence with a sense of wholeness really is connected to having the largest portion of your highest being present within your body and accessible to you at all times. And that, understanding how many of us operate at a fraction of that rate throughout our lives, and how it often denies the world what we came here to bring, I think is a conversation that we should be having more frequently.
Yeah.
Across the globe.
I love that. I love your use of emerging with wholeness. Beautiful.
Yeah, I think that many of us don't even think about emerging because we hold so much of ourselves inside and only allow those things to come forward that we believe are going to be socially acceptable, that are going to allow us to have a sense of belonging, even if it's a false sense of belonging based on the illusion of what we're putting forward. So the act of emerging is revolutionary in so many ways.
It's beautiful. One of the early chapters in your beautiful book, Sacred Instructions, you start with describing where are we now? And I just love to hear you comment on that and anything that's, emerged since you wrote the book.
Well, I think when I'm looking at where we are now, it's a snapshot in time, but it's part of a much larger arc of the evolution of our consciousness. And so even though there are shifting sands, and the lens is getting wiped clean, I think, in a lot of ways during this time. So new things that have been hidden in the shadows are coming into our conscious awareness, being dragged out into the light, often in the middle of the street, where we can't avoid them. And we're being forced to deal with. There's a reckoning in some ways going on in regard to the history that we've collectively been responsible for building. And so where we are at this time is the result of the distortions of a number of colliding illusions. And now we're clearing away the smoke, and we're looking at what have these illusions led us to. I teach a class on gender and sexuality and Native American culture for the local university here. And I was talking to my students this morning, and we talk a lot about stereotypes and about racism. We talk about colonization. We talk about all of these distortions of thought that have been normalized and embedded into the social gospel, and how those things are responsible for framing the reality that we exist within. And, that we have over time collectively been responsible for creating a world that none of us would choose to live in individually.
Right.
And so how do we come to recognize our power and our responsibility in that creation, and then to use that knowledge to create something very different going forward?
I would love you to elaborate on that. How do we come to recognize our power and use it toward the benefit of life?
Well, I think that this is a wonderful question. I'm glad you asked me this question. I think that one of the things that is true about the way that things enter into our consciousness is that energies that have, they're not new, right? They've been in existence and they linger on the fringes until there's a need for them to enter into the field. And so the way that things tend to enter into the mainstream is it'll jump onto a well-worn track. And we have this these notions of our co-creative abilities, of our abilities to actually physically manifest the things that we want to experience in real life, which in a lot of ways is connected to what's been described and watered down in so many ways, and really stereotyped, but this notion of shamanism. Mm-hmm. And it's really about understanding how we engage the creative powers of the universe. These are acts of creation, and they've become known in modern times as laws of abundance, laws of attraction. They've come in on a track that was tied to notions of capitalism, of craving, and addiction, our addiction to consumption, in order for it to fully saturate into the mainstream culture. And so everybody happily created their vision boards and put them on their refrigerator and began to do the things that were necessary to manifest what they wanted to have in their life. And it was like unleashing a bunch of children in a toy store and saying, go get whatever you want. And at the end of the day, coming back and seeing, broken toys and a huge mess, chaos all over the toy store. And then we wonder, how did this happen? Mm-hmm. How did this happen? Where did this big mess come from? And so, now that we have the capacity to be able to do that, we have to tie a higher level of consciousness to that practice. Mm-hmm. And so it's time to graduate from, manifesting for the sake of our own individual sense of want, and moving into collective manifestation for the sake of survival on the planet, for the healing of the earth, for the healing of the natural world, for the healing of the animals, for the healing of our hearts and minds as human beings, for the washing away of the illusion that allows people to continue to destroy the planet that we're all reliant upon for survival. We have the ability to be able to create a world that is in alignment with the type of life that we most want to be living collectively. And I think that most people, very, very few people would want to have a world that was filled with violence and hatred and destruction and consumption to the point of death for not only species, but the planet herself. And most people would want to live a life where they and their children could live in relative peace, where there could be kinship between them and those closest to them, including the beings who live in the natural world. And so now it's time for us to shake off our childlike need for more, our childlike desires to create without any consideration for how our creation impacts the rest of life. Mm-hmm. It's time for us to grow up emotionally and spiritually and start taking responsibility for the big mess that we've all created collectively, mm-hmm. and to engage the process of gathering together with the intention of actively creating the world we want to inhabit. And so how does that look in real life? I mean, that looks like groups of people coming together and making a determination that they are going to, create their vision boards for the healing of their local ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And they're going to look at what all those pieces look like, and they're going to bring those things into fruition. It looks like them learning how to live with less. I mean, that's one of the gifts of COVID. Yeah. Is that we have been learning to live without the things that we felt were essential for our happiness prior to COVID, and we're learning that we don't really need those things. So there are some people who have made a sport of online buying as a result of COVID. But most people are just learning to live with less. I think that we have the capacity to be able to create amazing shifts. I know of a story that I think is just remarkable, that I can't name the particulars, but I do know that there were a group of people who got together, and every day they invested their energy into shifting the heart and mind of someone who was in a position of authority and was doing real harm in that position. Essentially they prayed for this person, and they all thought about, what is it that we want them to realize? What do we want to connect between their heart and their mind, and then connect their heart and their mind deeply to the roots of Mother Earth, so that they have this real dawning, inescapable awareness, conviction within their being of the harm that they're causing. And within 12 weeks, that person came forward and had a press conference and said, I can no longer, in good conscience, be in this position and continue to do this harm. Wow. And actually named the harm publicly.
Wow.
And so, we have the capacity to be able to help, but instead what we do is we condemn and we criticize and we judge and we reinforce the things that we don't want, because what we feed grows. And so, I think that there's tremendous opportunity within that realm for us as human beings to be able to create change.
It's really beautiful.
It seems that so much of that kind of growing up process is also the capacity to look both back in terms of the history and the generational trauma, especially in the United States, around genocide and slavery, and also the capacity to look forward and the consequences of what's happening with our planet. And it seems that there's so much denial and anesthesia around the just the deep harm and suffering. And what resources do you think people need to be able to take those realities in, like on a non-conceptual level?
I mean, I think that one of the challenging things I've done so many classes and workshops with people all over on addressing the harm that is playing out before our eyes, the realizations. I mean, today, as we're doing this recording, it's March 18th. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. I had a conversation with a number of people yesterday about why do we have a holiday that celebrates the killing of the pagan people in Ireland?
Right.
And why do we have, holidays here that celebrate people like Christopher Columbus? Yeah. Why do we have holidays that celebrate genocide? Why do we have holidays that celebrate mass murder, oppression, the destruction of entire groups of human beings, entire populations, because they don't agree with the norms of those who seek to be in positions of power? And so, just how do we change the stories that we're telling? And how do we begin the process of telling the truth without people being massively triggered? Because the fact is that people are saturated. They're saturated with imagery of violence. They're saturated with this imagery of a normalization of hatred and destruction. I don't ever watch commercial television, but I remember one time I was on a trip somewhere, and I had done a number of days on the road, back to back to back events, and I was exhausted. And I was in a hotel room, and I was going to just totally tune out and watch something, fun and mindless on television. And my only option was a DIY home improvement show, because every other channel had some type of police show. That was showing, a seemingly ordinary life on Main Street America that was infused with incredible violent crime. And when that's on every single channel, this normalization of violence, you have an incredibly traumatized population that can sit and watch that as entertainment. And so we have to look at what created the scenario that created the society that finds that kind of violence and trauma entertaining. And look at the violence that's imbued within the history that has been normalized, that has become a pedestrian part of our lives. And we need to look no further than the things that are glorified within our culture. Things like, St. Patrick's Day, Columbus Day, statues, monuments to those who were responsible for killing the indigenous people of this land. We need to be willing to look at how those systems and structures were put in place, how they're maintained and upheld, and how we can engage the process of dismantling those things so that our sons and daughters don't grow up thinking that the way that you achieve success is to be like those individuals who are held up and idolized within our nations. And it's often those who have committed horrific crimes against humanity and genocidal acts of violence against populations. And they're sainted, or they're memorialized in some other way as being heroic adventurers, and we have allowed that, we have normalized that, and we condemn and we criticize and we tear apart those who challenge those things. So how does the challenging and the disruption of those narratives then become the norm? That's what we need to be working toward.
I think there's something so beautiful in both hearing your voice and reading your words, in your groundedness and your clarity and your heart. Even the story you shared earlier about not condemning and criticizing, but praying for, clarity in the people who are doing harm. And I would just love to ask, I know Carl asked earlier, where do people, what resources do they need to be able to engage this? And I'm curious, how you would describe, where do you draw your strength to engage in the way that you do so beautifully?
Well, I think that this is true with anyone who is able to articulate clearly what they see around them, is that they've most oftentimes had to walk through fire to get there. And I think that at some point you just sit down in the midst of the fire and you take a look around. And then you find tools that will help to stop the burning. And that's born out of necessity oftentimes. And so, people who have gone through the fire and had to find those tools for themselves, I think, are best situated to be able to guide others even though it's those who have really never had those experiences that are often glorified. But I had to learn how to sink myself into the soil to stop the burning.
Mm-hmm.
I had to learn how to, bring the water to my parched lips, just to be able to soothe the ache that I had within me from the immense amount of trauma that I experienced as a young Indigenous woman growing up in a country that's, primary goal for hundreds of years was to ensure my extinction. And so when you grow up and you have a necessity for being able to keep yourself grounded, you have to, you have a willingness in your heart to seek those tools. And so for me, that was born out of necessity of from a place of deep, deep pain. And what I learned to do was to, one, stop trying to scour myself clean from the wounds of my past. I recognized that scouring was an act of violence that I was now committing against myself. I learned to accept that what has happened to me in my life and what has happened to my people is factual. There's no changing the story of what happened in the past. And so there comes a point in time when there has to be a level of acceptance that story exists. And I began the process of accepting what exists because I lived within the framework of that existence. And if I couldn't accept what had happened and what the story was, then I would never be able to fully accept my own existence. And, in the midst of that accepting, I found ways to bring soothing to my own soul by sitting with that pain in a way that allowed for it to know this part of me that was so wounded, not only by my own life, but by generations. That wounded part of me was safe within my own body. And so how we go about that process, I think is different for a lot of people, but, the act of coming to recognition of our rejection of ourselves and the ways that we are committing violence against ourselves by refusing to accept the truth of our own history and trying to scrub it away. That moment of recognition for me, there was just this immense tenderness in that moment of realization where I just gently reached out to the part of me that was wounded and I just sat with that part and held it for a long time. Until there was a place where we could sit together comfortably and eventually merge back into one whole being, where there was a place for that hurt to exist within me without it having to drive the vehicle, without that wound being in charge of navigation. We found a way to all coexist inside of one body, all of these wounded pieces, in a way where the most informed part of me got to come forward and decide our direction. And that's a journey that all of us, I think, need to take. And the way that we do that is we help to create more spaces within our own communities, within our own families, within our own groups, where we can sit with one another with our wounds present without having to poke at them or try to fix them or judge them or try to clean them, to just let them sit in the room with us and be aware of their existence, and learn to deal with the cold chill that runs down our back in the presence of such wounding. And eventually we realize that the story isn't going to kill us. Denial of the story is going to kill us, because the denial of the story continues to create the distortions that we're currently living in. And so if we look at history, there's a history, and there's it's hard. I talk a lot with my hands, so I'm trying to think of how do I express this visually in a way that that people don't have to actually see me. But you think about a landscape, okay, and people are moving along this path in the landscape, and then a meteor comes down and just smashes into the ground in front of the people. And they have this clear path from point A to point B, and the ground is all damaged, and it's charred, and it's burning, and the living beings that were in that space where that hit have all been decimated. And the path has to go out and around that decimation. And it shifts the trajectory of that movement, right, from point A to point B. And it creates distortions in the path. And so trauma is like that. And so when we think about energetic pathways for our emotional well-being, trauma is the meteor in the path. And when we have that trauma within us, which everyone does, because our bodies are not designed to deal with the amount of trauma that we're seeing playing out before us, we grow up and we respond and we maneuver in a reaction to that trauma, and we create a distortion in our path of our emotional growth, in our energetic movement. And so all of that gets held within our bodies. And maybe we're pretending in this lifetime, right, that something didn't happen, but everyone in proximity to us knows that it happened. What happens to the third generation or the second generation out who doesn't know that there's a meteor in the middle of the path? All they know is the distortion. And the distortion to them has become the norm.
Right.
Like, we as a society are living the distortion of our history without acknowledging the distortion. And we've normalized it to the point where the forgetting is part of the trauma response.
Yeah, right.
I love how that ties back in with just what you were saying about St. Patrick's Day, Columbus Day, Yeah, the story is rooted in the forgetting and the trauma.
Right. And so if we want to be able to address that, then we have to do the remembering. That's the going back to move forward. And I often use the metaphor of a moving tire when I'm speaking to people about, the time that we're living in. That, if you think about a tire and you're riding on a tire and you're reaching the top of the tire and you're like, woohoo, I'm moving, right? I'm going places. And then all of a sudden, oh, now I'm heading down. Oh my goodness. Now I'm getting squeezed between the tire and the pavement. And then I'm being propelled backwards. And that cycle continues to happen over and over again. And depending on where you are on the wheel, you can either feel like you're being propelled forward, or you can feel the pain and the friction and the tension of the movement, or you can feel like you're being propelled backwards. And so when you don't understand the cyclical nature of our learning and that it's connected to that type of cycle, and it's a long arc, whole generations can be in the friction of movement. And so right now we are in the friction of movement, right? We are in the place where the tire meets the road. This is where all of the juicy stuff happens. This is where, everything that needs to be revealed is coming to the surface, demanding our attention. And if we want to be able to have that sense of spiraling forward and propelled movement, we have to be able to sit with the tension of the friction point that creates that movement, and to do what we need to do in the moments of those friction points, which is to address the obstacles that are on the road. And, the road right now in front of us is littered with the consequence of our past behaviors.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could tie this. You write so beautifully about prophecy in your book, and that this is also a time of prophecy, and how the kind of fruits of all of that forgetfulness are meeting certain opportunities of being alive in this time for healing that.
I think that there's this great misunderstanding of prophecy amongst the mainstream population, where they think of prophecy as fortune telling, and they see it as something that is set in stone. And for us, the way that we view prophecy is very much the way that you would read a map. That it says, this is the likely outcome if you continue traveling on this road. Right. These are the things that are going to happen if you choose this path. When you get to this point, you have a crossroads that you have to determine which direction you're going to go. Are you going to start climbing in the evolution of your consciousness, or are you going to go straight and drive off, drive humanity off the planet into a mass extinction? And I think that that's how prophecy needs to be viewed. It's telling us, things that were foretold, not as an absolute. It's not a spectator sport. What it is it's an opportunity for us to really recognize the landmarks on the path, so that we will know when we have taken a wrong turn. So that we'll understand that when we get to this place, and we find ourselves at this particular crossroad, that to go one way equates with death, and to go the other equates with life. And to be able to align ourselves with the path that leads to life. And so when we think about prophecy in regard to my tradition as Skijinui Apid Nilbanawabskewi, as an Indigenous woman from the Wabanaki nations, that prophecy is a guidepost. It is meant to be a lived experience. It's a participatory event where we get to actively choose the course that we will take into the future based on the knowledge that has been sent forward for us from the past. And so, there are so many prophecies from so many traditions that are lining up right now and pointing, with neon arrows to the crossroads that we are at as human beings. And there's very clear signs that this way leads to death, destruction of the planet. And this path over here leads to life, to the sustaining of our humanity. Not only the survival of our species, but the sustaining of our humanity, the recentering of our heart in alignment with the rest of life. And that's the path that, we're standing in the road, frantically using our arm signals to try to get people to turn in that direction. And The people who are standing right now in Minnesota at line 3 who are saying, you can't come in here and destroy all of our wild ricing lakes. Not only because it's a destruction of our cultural continuity, but also you're going to destroy this entire ecosystem and these waterways for generations to come. They're standing on that road, pointing people in the direction that leads toward life. And people, look at that and they're failing to see what's happening. And so, if we can begin to understand the role of prophecy and the way that it is inspiring Indigenous peoples to stand up in protection of life right now, then perhaps more people will align with those who are making that stand. Perhaps more people will begin to stand with those who are trying so desperately to preserve our capacity to continue to exist here on Mother Earth. And for me, that guide stone it provides me with an incredible sense of hope, because our ancestors knew that we would arrive in this place. They understood that we would be facing the very challenges that we're facing today. And they sent forward information for us to help us to navigate this time. If we fail to heed their warning and to take their advice and to use the instructions that they've given to us, then, we'll have no one but ourselves to blame when we are forced as a species to exit the planet because we've made it inhabitable. And so, to me, when I think about prophecy, it's all of those things.
Beautiful.
Do you want to take that into talking about your own dream and project that arose out of that? And also, I'm curious what has shifted with COVID and where you see that going.
I'm assuming you're talking about Healing Turtle Island.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. So Healing Turtle Island is not necessarily a project. It's a response, a direct response to a prophecy from our territory that relates to the reopening of the Eastern spiritual doorway, the Eastern Gate. And so in that prophecy, what we're told is that in our traditions, the East is the direction of creation. The East is where life enters into the sphere of existence, and the West is where life exits. And so when we think about these spiritual doorways, what happens underneath that Eastern Gate and whatever's given life to under that Eastern Gate grows and moves steadily toward the West, living out its lifespan. And so what happened here in this territory, Chquabanakieg, which is the place of first light. It's the most eastern part of North America, both in the United States and Canada, which is where my people come from. And it was here in our territory where their first contact was made. And this is where the newcomers first came to this land. And so the stories talk about how the agreements that were formed here were the ones that set the framework for what was created in this territory. So when we think about the creation of the United States, the creation of what's known as Canada here in Indigenous territory is those things were created under that Eastern doorway. And so they were given life, and that life has grown and it's expanded and it's been exported. And really it has been exported around the world at this point in time. And so what the prophecies tell us is that at a certain point in time, the elders, spiritual elders, recognized what was happening, and that the agreements that were being forged in blood and deception. And that the shaking of the hand that was extended to Indigenous people was a hand that was hiding a gun behind its back in the other hand. And they recognized what was being created, and they went into ceremony and they closed that eastern doorway, so that no more of that kind of destruction would be able to pass through that doorway. So they closed it down for the protection of all people. And we can see the evidence of what's been born out of the violence that has emerged here when we look at the rates of violence in this country, which are higher than any other place in the world. So the prophecy says that when the people of the earth begin to rise up collectively from all walks of life in protection of Mother Earth, that the people will need to come back under that eastern door and come into ceremony together to heal their relationships with one another, to heal their relationships with other beings in the natural world, and to heal their relationship with Mother Earth. And once they had done that, then they would come together collectively and reopen that eastern doorway and make a new sacred agreement to give birth to a new way of being in relationship with one another going forward that would heal the wounds of the past. And so that prophecy is at the heart of healing the wounds of Turtle Island. And so there was a dream connected to it that I had for 47 years. And then when the time came for the ceremony to be held, the elders said, "No, you hold the ceremony and we will come and we'll support you." And so that's what happened. And we had elders from 6 continents, Indigenous elders from 6 continents who came to the first gathering. It grew every year since the beginning. The first gathering was in the summer of 2017. And the message of that ceremony, because it's not a festival, it's not a conference, it's all ceremony. It's very humble, very reverent, and it's not aspects of it are not largely televised. We have certain sections that will allow people to record to share with others who can't be there, but most of the ceremonies are just done very quietly and very humbly there. And it's been life-changing for a lot of people, myself included, in the ways that it has facilitated healing. And the healing that has risen up there has been taken by these people from 6 continents back to their homelands, where they are then perpetuating healing in relation to what they experience there within themselves. And so it's growing. And the ceremony is a 21-year ceremony. So it stays in the East for 4 years. So it was in the East for 4 years. This last year, we had to have it online because of COVID. We still had ceremony here, but it wasn't open to the public. And then we had 45,000 people who tuned into the online portion of the ceremony that we had. And we had speakers from 30 different Indigenous nations from around the world.
Wow.
And so this year, we have to move the ceremony to the South. So in 2021, it's the first year in the South. It'll be in the South for 4 years before it'll move to the West, and then it'll move to the North. And then those prayers from all of those directions will be held in the center of the country. And on the 21st year, it'll come back to the Eastern doorway, where it will close the circle. And so that the East is where the agreement, that sacred contract of living in a new way with one another, finding new pathways to have a form of kinship that honors, respects, and seeks to equalize the lives that we're all living, that has a reverence for the sacredness of life, that acknowledges the right that Mother Earth has to live unmolested by human desire. All of those things happen in the first 4 years of the ceremony. So that new agreement was birthed. And in the South, what will happen is the spiritual and emotional healing connected with the birthing of that story and the laying to rest of the old story will continue. And so it's an ongoing process. There is a healingturtleisland.org website that has limited information about the gathering, and some pictures of the gathering on there. And this year we probably will not have the ceremony again open to the larger public. We will have a group of people from one individual from a number of different nations who will come together and do ceremony together there. And then again, we'll have an online event where we'll bring in all of the people who are going to speak about the prophecies and about where we are and where we're heading. What is the wisdom that needs to be shared at this time? And then next year in 2022, we're hoping that we can once again open the doors to the public to join us. And so, the more people that participate, even with the online event, which we didn't have any idea how it was going to be, because we had about 2,000 people who came in person in 2019, a little over 2,000 people. And we weren't sure how it was going to be, to do that online, but we just trusted that, this is the path that we're on. So this is how it's meant to be done. And, we were shocked when we realized that we had, 45,000 people from around the world who were tuning in because they wanted to know, what are the messages that we most need right now, from a spiritual perspective, in order to harmonize and balance our lives with the rest of creation. And so many people wrote that it had given them hope in ways that nothing else had been able to give them hope in these months of challenge that we've all been facing. And so we'll be persevering with that and continuing to do that, because it's now alive and it's taken on a life of its own. And we're just holding the door, at this point, we're just holding the door open for the spirit that entered in through that gateway to do what it needs to do here to help facilitate that healing.
Every time I've heard you speak about this, and just now too, I feel goosebumps and tears, and it's just astonishingly beautiful. Thank you so much.
It's we have had experiences with this ceremony that have really solidified for us the notion that we are not in charge of what's happening with this particular ceremony, because there really is something essential that came in through that doorway that has changed in really dramatic ways the course of people's lives. And so we have people who were traveling, who are, real, dyed in the wool capitalists who heard about it and thought it, Maine is a place where there's a lot of vacationers, and thought that, hey, this sounds interesting. They just happened to hear about it from somebody while they were here, and were told that it was going on, and they decided to drive out to, like it was some type of sideshow to see Indians together praying, and ended up completely changing their careers and the ways that they engage with life after being there for one day.
Wow.
I didn't do that. Yeah. Nobody else that was there that spoke that day did that. There was something that happened within that individual that changed the way that they saw the world. And we've seen that time and time again from people who have been a part of this, that it's just radically changed and upturned and reorganized their entire life after being there. So, it really kind of comes with a warning at this point in time. If you enter through these gates, we are not responsible for how your life changes. after you leave, because, it can oftentimes be a very disruptive feeling process of having your molecules reorganized into a way that is in alignment with where we want to go rather than where we've been.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's really an honor, incredibly humbling honor to be at the doorway watching this unfold before our eyes. It's really, really beautiful for us.
It's so beautiful. I'm just thinking as you were talking about molecules rearranging, people getting disoriented, reoriented, of that list in your book of, Indigenous values compared to Euro-American values of, cooperation versus competition, and on, the whole thing. And just may we all be, who are on the Euro-American values side, be disoriented and reorganized to the more, for me, definitely more beautiful set of values you describe.
Yeah, I think in that list, the one that I think is really most critical at this time, we've seen it in the division and the vitriol that has erupted around this country. The one of humility.
Right.
And that any great leader, anyone who is truly capable of leading, has to have incredible humility, because they have to be willing to admit when they're wrong. They have to be willing to acknowledge that there's something that they don't know. And they have to be willing to sit in a posture of receptiveness so that they can learn what it is that they need to know in order to move forward. And the whole way that society has been structured has been in such a way that we have failed to allow space for that type of humility, because admitting that you don't know something is often seen as weakness, and rather than as a strength. And we need to really flip that narrative if we want to have really competent leaders guiding us into this new way of being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just looking at, both Carl and I here have lists on our own pages of so many more questions we want to ask you, and we're going to run out of time to continue the conversation. But I'm wondering, and I can tell Carl wants to ask something too, but I'll start with just asking where people can learn more if they feel like I do right now, of like, wow, just magnetism to the wisdom and vision that you share. How might people continue or follow that?
Well, I'm not really good about my online presence. I'm trying to find a person that can be better about that than I am. So I'll add that caveat to the guidance. But certainly there are a number of ways. I have a public Facebook page, which is facebook.com/sacred instructions. And then also I have a website, sacredinstructions.life, LIFE, where there are a lot of things on there, but the website needs to be updated. And I also, my organization, the Land Peace Foundation, has a website, landpeacefoundation.org, where they can find out information on Wajukam Toltina, which is the kinship community that I have here where I live. We're building a kin-centric model of relational living here based on Indigenous values, and also building a learning center here so that we can continue this process into the future. And then on Healing Turtle Island, there's also information on that available on the website, the Land Peace Foundation website as well.
Yeah, I love this line from chapter 4 of the book, where you said, if we hope to write a new story, we must first change our minds about the nature of the divine and about our individual and collective power. And repeatedly you talk about just the uniqueness of each person's song, each person's participation in this larger situation that we're in, and how to reimagine that individual and collective power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that, that's so critically important for us to understand. And so the follow-up to Sacred Instructions, which I'm finishing up now, is really focused on understanding the sacred science that's embedded within our ways of knowing and ways of being as Skijinawak peoples. And because I feel like those stories have been left out of the narrative of the larger faith communities of the world that have been promoted, that the indigenous ways of knowing and ways of being have been stereotyped and dehumanized and diminished to the degree that they have been made invisible to the larger population. And at the heart of those teachings, there really exists a way to understand how we fit into the larger scheme of creation, but also what are our responsibilities based on the power that we know that we have as creators, co-creators of the reality that we're living in. So, for instance, the first chapter of the book is on indigenous oral traditions and the sacred science of sound, and understanding how, vibration and frequency create form, and the ways that that form carries forward into the reality that we're living in, but also looking at the role of mirror neurons, and looking at the ways that, ancestral memory, just like traumatic memory, is stored within our bodies. And if you think about a soldier hearing fireworks and they have a visceral response in their body based on the traumatic memory that is being held in their body, when we find the right frequency to unlock our ancestral memory, when we can get in coherence with that frequency, we have access to all of that information as well. And so understanding that sacred science of sound that's tied to our oral traditions, understanding the ways that, how the laws of motion describe to us the way that what we manifest stays in a perpetual state of motion until we as co-creators become the force that stands in its way, reorganizes it, and redirects it in another direction, and helping us to understand how do we engage with that knowledge in order to create the change that we so desperately need in the world today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sherri. I just so appreciate your visionary work and your total generosity of spirit and sharing. May thousands of blessings continue to shower on you and what you're bringing forth in the world.
Thank you so much. And, thank you for being persistent in trying to reach out, and for giving me this opportunity to have this conversation with you. It's been lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we so look forward to your new book. It's exciting to hear.
I'm really enjoying it. So every time I sit down and I'm reading a piece of it, to begin the writing again, I'm getting excited about it every single time that I work on it. And so I feel like as I'm writing it, I'm uncovering within myself deeper aspects of these teachings that have been part of my life since I was a small child. And so it's reinvigorating it within me as I'm writing it, and enlivening it and bringing it to life in this way too. So I'm also excited about it.
I have those goosebumps again. Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you enjoy this podcast, it's great if you want to share it with friends or post about it on social media. Also, you could make a donation to support the podcast or find out more information about our classes and offerings at our website, embodimentmatters.com.